Welcome back this afternoon. I'd like to welcome Larry Rickels and Avital Ronell, who are going to speak with us this afternoon about Kafka. And I'm particularly pleased to have them here. They are not only colleagues with whom I've been engaged for many years, but I see.
I'm not here.
Ja, du kannst freilich bleiben, wenn du willst. In any case, as you may know, both Larry and Avital have taught Kafka for many years, have written on Kafka, and have been engaged in thinking about different dimensions of Kafka's work. I asked them if they could to think a little bit about law and about the problem of a broken or thwarted theology, which is part of what we've been considering in these last days. I'll tell you, just as a way of offering a brief summary, that we began our seminar by looking at two parables of Kafka. One is Das Ziel, or I sometimes try to say it differently, but My Destination, and then The Coming of the Messiah. And then we also took a look at the parable on parables, and we then moved to talk about Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history, and this morning we spent a long time talking about Benjamin's readings of Kafka and epic theater, focusing on his notions of gesture, interruption, and the problem of messianic time. So we've been thinking a lot about messianic time lately, and what that is. But one of the things we started with was a consideration of commandments and how they work, imperatives, injunctions, in the parable translated as My Destination. The so-called master orders that his horse be brought from the stable, and the servant doesn't understand him, and or at least it's reported that the servant doesn't understand him, and the master has to go saddle and mount the horse himself. And at another point in the parable on parables, it is said that a wise person says, "Geh hinüber," go over, or go across, go over there. And it seems to be a moment in which a certain kind of transcendence is being pointed to. Go there, over there, and yet that where is that there? And is it possible to go anywhere at all? Within the parable, a second voice emerges that questions whether it's useful, whether it would matter if we could, wouldn't help with our daily cares, even if we could. And the two voices go back and forth on this question of whether it's possible to become a parable or to go over, as the wise man apparently said one should. And it turns out that neither clear transcendence nor a clear transubstantiation is possible. And that comes out, I think, even more clearly in The Coming of the Messiah, where we analyzed both the first and second paragraphs and spent some time thinking about what it means that the Messiah will come on the day after his arrival, and what kind of challenge to the calendar that is. Is this a new calendar, as Benjamin suggests in the Theses on the Philosophy of History? Is it is it a challenge to space and time as we know it? But I think we've been looking at kind of truncated or abbreviated theological moments, ones that can't be realized or which point to a possible transcendent move that's not realizable. And we've talked a little bit about how we've been incited to the theological and then thwarted at the same time, that the text both incites and thwarts any movement toward a theological redemption, restitution, transcendence, transubstantiation. But I thought today we might return to the question of the law or the imperative, or what is expected from law. It seems to me that before the law we have a strange kind of gleaming, shimmering light that's coming from the recesses of the law, or maybe it's being attributed, or maybe it's coming from that other region. We did talk a little bit about emanation and illumination and Kabbalistic light, and how that functions a little bit for Benjamin. We also talked about the problem of whether the law can ever be embodied by a person or by a character, and why it is that the coming of the Messiah seems to sustain a critique of the idea that the Messiah could be a person or an individual. And it prompts us or challenges us to think of the Messianic not as anthropomorph, and not as a single event that will happen one day, but if it will happen, or if it has any kind of meaning, it will be on the far side of those kinds of days that follow one another according to the usual calendar of days. And yet in the judgment, for instance, we get an interesting kind of personification. The father is the father-in-law. I know, and many of us here have heard Avital's very brilliant work on Kafka's letter to his father. And today I think we'll also hear from Larry a bit on the figure of the father within the judgment, whether, in what way the legal or indeed theologically vested legal categories like the law and judgment function there. And we'll also talk about before the law, which is, I think, an extraordinary excerpt, really a section from the trial, which again involves a strange conversation. Many of the texts by Kafka we've been reading involve at least two voices going back and forth. It happens in the parables. It happens certainly before the law, and it happens again in the judgment in some odd ways. I have some things to say about it, but I'm going to wait. I guess the one point I'd like to make about before the law, before the law, is simply this. That there's some controversy about whether Kafka is working within the oral traditions of Judaism, the Haggadah, or whether he's working in the halakhic, the traditions of rabbinic law. And Sholem has lots to say about that. But what's really interesting about before the law is that we get a story which would seem to belong to Haggadah, and then we get a set of commentaries which try to figure out if there is a principle or if there is a definitive reading of the story. So we get both story and commentary. And we might understand that as a certain way of thinking about both the tradition of story and the tradition of law coming together in some very strange ways.
Would it be okay to throw Luther into the mix?
Yeah, because Luther
Nailed
already
the
arrived.
text.
Yeah, Luther already arrived. We wondered about the translator who decided to take über den Begriff der Geschichte and make it into theses on the philosophy of history. And we're not opposed, right? Because there is a Luther moment over
Yeah,
there.
that's a good point.
Anyway, without further ado, I think I'll turn to you, Avital.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for the very warm and kind invitation for Larry and me to participate. And just wanted to say, Larry and I prepared for years for this moment, starting this morning. And Larry pointed out to me that Urteil etymologically links up with ordeal, which brings us to the trial and to testing grounds that I would like to get to with you today, and Kafka. But because everything will be decided by the perhaps faux decisiveness of a text that introduces itself, presents itself, and seems to have as its object a judgment. We really don't know what the status of the title is, and that's something that I'm going to want to discuss with regard to everything. But today, Fordham Gazette, before the law, what the status, also the legal status. No book can be published without a title, so that a title is already legally mandated. But when a text calls itself the judgment, does it say to you, I'm now going to present judgment, I'm going to perform, enact it, I'm going to tell about it, I'm going to annul it, I'm going to undo it, or I'm going to perform some sort of rogue performativity on the impossibility of, or the literal push over the edge of the literal and metaphorology, and so on and so forth, in order to get a real sense of the drama of Kafka's opening shot, as Larry will show us, because Kafka really got off on this text, as Larry will show us. I think I will first turn the mic over to Larry so he can establish the groundwork for us. And I will just say that, since I deigned to mention with some irony Luther, that for Luther, judgment was a real problem because everyone gets off on judgment, according to Luther. In fact, you have to put a restraining order, a gag order on those, and that's everyone who wants to judge everyone and everything at the top speed, so that when you have a rush to judgment, as you know it in popular parlance perhaps, it's also, we might consider the rush of judgment, the rush it is to judge. And I'd like us to consider the libidinal investment that Luther sees in judgment and legislates against judgment. In other words, judgment will only be the provenance of sovereignty and the privilege of anyone appointed by divine authority and authoritarianism. Not everyone. So one of Luther's projects is to put a serious historical restraining order on judgment. Like, who are you to judge me? I really mean it when I say that. But there's all sorts of problematics that even precede our ability to name a text, the judgment. And Larry is going to show us the many modalities, the original sites of the ability to fell a judgment, to feel a judgment, to be devastated by the hint of a judgment, whether or not it proves to be what we think we understand by judgment. So, according to Luther, everyone judges everyone. This is because there's an intense desire to be judging. Then those of us on the masochistic side of things want to be judged, and thus we publish, we teach, we learn, we beg to be judged and decimated. So I'd like us to also consider the fabulous dark side of judging, acts of judgment, and the refusal to judge. I'm not judging you. That's not pretty when they say that to me. I don't know how you feel. I'm not judging you, but. And then, I don't know what that's called, what happens after the but. You know? And then I'm running out the window and the bridge and all that. And saying,
Over we go.
yeah, I really love you. Crash, boom, bang, you know? So with these words, I introduce my colleague and friend and sometime husband, Larry. Shut up. Hey, I thought this would be the place to make a little marriage offer.
It's very clear. It's very clear.
That didn't work, right? We have witnesses.
So I actually did prepare an introduction to the judgment, especially in as much as the judgment is an introduction to Kafka. It introduces us to the various conditions that made it possible or impossible for him to be writing. It was his strongest claim, that he was nothing but literature, that he was Schriftsteller sein, and that he was writing. And this enterprise brings with it a pervasive relationship to the law that I'm going to try to introduce via the judgment. Before there was the judgment, the introduction of Kafka. Kafka was engaged in a writing enterprise that Deleuze and Guattari admirably summarize, really in the one book of theirs I kind of like for a minor literature, where they show how Kafka, as his basic experience of writing, pursued a kind of nomadic, anarchic impulse. At the same time, they add to that accurately that that same impulse was part of a kind of networking drive across dispatched and self-addressed modes of writing, in particular, of course, letter writing and diary entries. So that was there in the beginning. Kafka began to allow stories to emerge, in other words, writing to emerge into a public or published arena under the influence of his friend Max Brod. Max Brod would bully him, would offer to be his agent, his medium. They would go on trips together with the proviso that they would both write up accounts of the trip, and Brod would be allowed to edit this work. So we owe to this curious phase of writing the story, for example, the airplanes in Brescia, which is the very first work in German letters to address mechanical flight. They'd literally gone to the air show, watched Elliot fly, and the result was the story. I think the Betrachtungen, the meditations, were sort of liminal works, as it were, that also rolled out from under this particular writing regime. In the meditations that were also published in 1912, the year of the judgment, we find in the last meditation something that we will continue to find in Kafka, explicit reference to ghosts. So in the last meditation, we encounter a child who emerges from the corridor as a small ghost, not like, but as a small ghost. And then in the ensuing debate or conversation with the neighbor, still out in the hallway, someone observes, these ghosts appear to be more in doubt about their existence than we are, which is no surprise given their fragility. Really a deeply relational representation of a ghost, I would argue. Okay, so as I said, the Kafka we know or we think we know, the Kafka of certain stories and unfinished novels, comes into existence with the judgment, the product of an all-nighter, which Kafka identified in a diary entry on the morning after as the ghost, Gespenst, of a single night and an unusually messy birth. He also noted in the same entry that he was thinking of Freud. When he later read the story to his sister, she recognized the layout of their own home, but then added, but then father's room would be the toilet. When writing the last line of the judgment, Kafka, as he confided to Max Brod, was thinking of a wild ejaculation. Now, as you probably know already, Verkehr should be the lessons. This is the moment of Georgs plummeting. In diesem Augenblick ging über die Brücke ein geradezu unendlicher Verkehr. So as he plummets, traffic, geradezu is hard to translate. How did they translate?
At this moment, an unending stream of traffic was just going over the bridge.
Okay, well, that still goes to show how hard it is to capture the geradezu. Geradezu, some people call it almost, which isn't fair, though it does underscore the paradox, almost endless. But it's virtually endless would be close to the meaning of geradezu. But in any event, Verkehr has many meanings in German. It can mean traffic, as you see. It can mean the commerce of letter writing, correspondence, but it also means sexual intercourse. The almost endless event at the end of the story. Throughout his relatively brief career, but just the same, a career filled with ambivalence and despair, he did manage always to stand by this particular text. It was the one he gladly signed. And it was after this breakthrough, as you can see in the diaries and elsewhere, that he tried to make it the model somehow or other for maintaining the best possible conditions for continuing to summon the writing that he had thus attained. For he discovered that his relationship to this writing was both fragile and all-encompassing. He soon came to certain decisions about how he would adjust the entirety of his libidinal life to this breakthrough, and decided that he would have to keep under control, as it were, that sexuality that is also referred to as coupling, and that he would have to avoid music and philosophy, so as to be able to remain in the ready position to receive this writing. Before he sought this encapsulation of his life, his libidinal life, in the relationship to being writing, he was already committed to a kind of hypochondriacal lifestyle, whereby he administered his reserves He was an alternative medicine and health fanatic, a sunbathing nudist who was careful to chew every bite of food 40 times before swallowing. I like to think of him as a kind of total California. So much for our theological fragment. But we know that his early turn away from allopathic to homeopathic medicine or maintenance was dedicated to the deaths in early childhood of his two older brothers, Georg and Heinrich. He claimed that it was the fault of medicine that those brothers had passed. But I can't help but think that he also saw those two brothers as having taken the brunt for him of conditions in the Kafka home that he already knew were abusive. Anyway, Georg, it is in the name of Georg that Kafka makes the breakthrough to the core of his being writing, which of course is at the same time, I don't know if forever, but at the same time, the encounter with the law of the Father. Now, the story tells us something about this law of the Father, and I'm going to look at it in two ways, via two clusters of examples that Kafka provides. The first comes to us via a diary entry of December 6, 1921, a rather famous reflection based on the letter he has just received, in which his correspondent speaks about ways in which the correspondence itself is warming, gives warmth during this cold season. And Kafka writes in response then in the diary, "Metaphors are among the many reasons to despair of writing. The lacking self-sufficiency of writing, its dependence upon the maid heating the stove, on the cat warming itself in front of it, even on the old man who warms himself. All these are self-sufficient, autonomous, eigengesetzliche activities. Only writing is helpless, abides not in itself, is a joke and despair." So what this entry strongly suggests or inspires would be to see Kafka's writing as a meditation on the joke and despair of being writing before or outside the law cited at least as Eigengesetzlichkeit. My next example is also a counterexample in the sense my conviction is that Kafka was particularly careful not to allow the father-son conflict in his case or in his writing to signify metaphorically, or I would add edibly. And yet the temptation was great. So, for example, there was the very famous case of Otto Gross, who was a psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist who became interested in psychoanalysis. In any event, the time came when he was kidnapped, disenfranchised, and hospitalized by his own father, Hans Gross, who counts from German language culture, as the father of criminology, which created an incredible disturbance, at least among European intellectuals. And Kafka was tempted to add to the protest an actual extended letter, as it were, or piece on and against the tyranny of fathers. But that never materialized. And whether he knew it or not, what interests me is that Otto Gross was at the same time an addict who regularly entered into regressed corners from which the father alone could save him, as it were. And this complete scenario, however, really fits the profound ambivalence of the father-son conflict in Father's case and works. Okay, so in the larger picture of Kafka's work, I would want to argue that there are two competing or alternating models of occult or technical mediation and communication. One is indeed nomadic, decentered, benign, often involving commerce with ghosts. The other is characterized by the father's superegoical command, which almost always takes the form of coming later to outblast the nomadic network, monopolize it, contain it, so that it is just the one-way channel of an annihilating command or verdict. Now, while that can be said in general when you take everything in Kafka into account, we see in the judgment that the alternation itself really first becomes possible, really is constituted by an aspect or agency of the father that precisely intervenes in the shallow end of a life of adaptation or survival. I'm talking about Georg's way of seeing now. Intervenes in this shallow perspective, even though I would add that clinically the shallowness, the bluntedness of Georg's perspective at the same time seems to possibly symptomatize traumatization itself. But in any event, we don't really see this alternation I referred to before between the ghostly network and the superegoical destructive command until the father disrupts a kind of steady state of mere survival and non-reading that precedes that interruption. So an aspect or agency of the father must return or be recalled before we can see or read better. As you have read, we enter the judgment with Georg, who has been writing a letter to his friend in Russia. While he's thus in the position of writer within a network of long-distance relations, Georg is also shown to be self-satisfied and shallow, marked by a kind of attention deficit disorder. Or one could also say that he borders on the sense that he has yet to reclaim, that he is hunted. In the midst of the father's return, in the midst of what I'm also calling a recollection, just as the father is beaming with insight, I remember that moment, strahlte vor Einsicht, Georg recalls that he had planned some time ago to always be on the alert, to be a super careful observer all the time, so that he could not be taken roundabout from the rear or from above by surprise. damit nicht irgendwie auf Umwegen von hinten her, von oben herab, überrascht werden könne. Now he remembered his determination, and yet he forgets it anew, as the narrative continues, as one pulls a short thread through the eye of a needle. Now, having said these two things about Kafka at large and the conflict in this particular story, I should point out that a certain space for the survival of the catastrophic moment of return and recall increases, expands in the course of Kafka's narratives. You see this, for example, in the story in the Penal Colony, where Kafka added a gap, a space between the main text in which the verdict is delivered, catastrophically delivered, and then the coda, anyway, the closing portion in which the traveling explorer does indeed read for the first time, is able to make his escape, though still under compromising conditions. But I would say part of the project of writing had to be the consideration of how to inhabit the space of survival and extend it, because it's really only in that space, I'm arguing, that the alternation, the important alternation becomes visible, legible, between commerce with ghosts and the malignant, eternal superego.
Can I offer the English translation of the part that you... This is after the father lifts up his skirts, which is my favorite part. We'll talk about that in a moment. The father, he stood up quite unsupported and kicked his legs out. His insight made him radiant. Georg shrank into a corner as far away from his father as possible. A long time ago, he had firmly made up his mind to watch closely every least movement so that he should not be surprised by any indirect attack, a pounce from behind or above. At this moment, he recalled this long-forgotten resolve and forgot it again, like a man drawing a short thread through the eye of a needle.
When we were preparing, Larry and I thought we might reenact that moment. I was going to be the father doing the can-can.
It sounds good.
But then we opted for sobriety of presentation in your class.
I see.
Another favorite moment while we're sharing is that when he really comes in for the kill, the father, when he says that I won't allow the friend in Russia to be betrayed. Remember, the father first begins by saying, you don't have a friend in Russia. And then he says, I won't allow his betrayal. I'm keeping him from being forgotten. I was all along his Vertreter, while you went on with your lying correspondence, because you forgot to take away from me my Schreibzeug. I have been conducting the correspondence, the only correspondence that counts, with your friendly ghost friend. And he reads this correspondence while bunching up your letters with the other hand. At that moment, Georg releases a one-word show of resistance. He says, "Komödiant," you comedian, which allows him to go on. Yes, indeed, I was a comedian. And the crescendo commences that leads then to the verdict. I recall that moment also because of that passage I read earlier about the joke and despair of writing.
That, by the way, can I just say that that's an aspect of Kafkan anxiety control that one forgets, which is the laugh track that is installed even in the most devastating Kafkan moments.
True.
But that actually rhymes with and is compatible with Freud's description of the superego. Superego is the one who tells you to enjoy, and we have that in old films and sitcoms when, with a German accent, we hear somewhere, "You will enjoy this," right? So the commanding superego is also the place from which the injunction to enjoy comes from. And that's a strange convergence that one tends to want to kick to the curb when thinking about Kafka, because the laugh track is always turned down because it confuses and intervenes with a certain kind of semantic regularity.
So, as the momentum proceeds that culminates in the verdict, I think that even though we have witnessed that Georg has been treating his Russian friend, his friend in Russia, to his own self-deception. There have been many constraints upon the correspondence and so on. Still, he has inhabited a structure that corresponds with long distance or across long distance with the long distant at a time that coincides with the passing of the mother. Because this becomes a key issue in their conflict. The father is going to condemn the son, also in the name of the dead mother. So however cursory his perspective may have been, also in regard to the marking of the mother's passing, still he enters this relationship with the ghost at the same time. And I think that's what becomes legible at the moment of this fatal conflict, which then becomes, I would want to argue, the space of survival of being writing elsewhere, or somehow here. So, just for the sake of the psychoanalytic lexicon, I want to point out that this father here, who comes from the toilet, as it were, in his dirty linen from behind, is not the Oedipal father, not the murdered father, not the father of adoption and substitution, but rather the father carefully identified by Kafka when he wrote his own interpretation of the story. I believe that same year in his diaries, where he interprets the name Bendemann as already signifying the bond at stake here, the bond between father and son, which Kafka then refers to as a circle of blood. But the Oedipal father is not the blood father. Instead, what we're referring to here is a very early father, the pre-Oedipal or primal father, who monopolizes sexuality, even sexual difference, in a commanding or penetrating way, and who is the sort of DNA father, the father of a kind of dad certainty, the father who has to come back and be remembered for this space of survival, of being, writing, and a kind of refusal of the metaphorical Oedipal conclusion to be able to unfold. So in closing my introduction, I want to read from one other Kafka source, which I think fits in This is a letter from a letter to Milena, written 10 years after the judgment, and it starts by his reflecting on the letter, reflecting on letter writing in the letter. It is a commerce, Verkehr, with ghosts, and not only with the ghost of the addressee, but with one's own ghost, which emerges from under one's hand in the letter one is writing, or even in a succession of letters in which each letter calls on the other as witness. Written kisses never arrive, but are consumed en route by the ghosts. Through this rich repast, the ghosts multiply in such unheard of manner. Mankind senses this and struggles against it. In order to exclude the ghostliness that comes between them, they invented the train, the car, the plane. But it's of no use. These are inventions made in the course of falling. The opposing side is so much stronger and calmer. They followed the invention of the postal system with that of the telegraph and the telephone. The ghosts will not starve, but we will plummet. So, again, in conclusion, if we pick up again with Kafka's own airplane story, and remember that he there identified artificial flight with writing to the extent that he calls the pilot compares, or no calls, identifies the pilot at the controls as a writer at his desk. We should keep in mind that at the time of this air show, through World War I, artificial flight, flying by plane, was indeed nomadic, anarchic, very hard to control, over-reliant on eyesight, impossible really to superintend. And of course that phase ends when radio control becomes possible. The control tower is erected and resituates flight in relation to some central authority of command. So it's here, this is how I would like to read the implicit allegory or genealogy here between Verkehr, traffic, and various command technologies and possibilities. That there is this plummeting, as we already saw in Das Urteil. But in the course of the plummeting, there is also that almost or virtually endless traffic, ultimately of invention, fabulation, what have you, that amounts to a kind of survival of the Urteil.
Right. It's interesting. I'm really, I have to say, I'm personally pleased to hear your reading of that final line, because so many of my undergraduate students just, he's dead. I said, well, I don't know if he's dead. I said, we couldn't hear anything. I mean, the way it reads, if an unending stream of traffic was going over the bridge at that very instance, not only can we not hear him drop, but we can't see him drop. Nobody can hear or see him drop. So there's a failure of figuration, one might say, right? There's no character left. But to say there's no character left at such a moment is not to say that writing ceases. And I wonder whether it's the something like the collapse of character for the purposes of the survival of writing. Because something is writing here. At this moment, an unending stream of traffic was just going over the bridge. Well, who are you? You haven't even introduced yourself. We have no idea who you are. But obviously there's a narrative voice that can continue even if and when the character is in some sense gone or inaccessible. And so I do think there's a a writing survival nexus at the very end, which most people don't read. You know, they go for the pathos of the, oh my God, you know. So I'm pleased to see it. In fact, yeah, I mean, boy, sexuality, traffic, invention, commerce, all something.
And also the drug traffic rush.
The drug
There's a libidinal rush also.
Yes, and it's the ejaculative
Yeah.
moment, no doubt, right? That's the burden of reading that text, knowing what he said about it, is in what sense is that fair? Is that final line an ejaculative line?
Exactly. Or giving the father pleasure.
Yes. Well, there is that for sure.
You
There is that for sure. I'm wondering if we could just take a moment for me to ask you about another dimension of this text, because I am, because you know, at one point, Georg carries his father in his arms, and the old man is on his breast playing with his watch chain, suggesting that the old man is very small, like has become infantilized. And then at another moment, the father springs erect in the bed, only one hand lightly touching the ceiling to steady him. So maybe impossibly large, and there's these vacillations of size that happen, and then the accusations begin, you wanted to cover me up, and then the fatal, and then the, well, imitation, the manic moment in which he lifts his own shirt, imitating the seduction of the son, and mounting the accusations, you disgraced your mother's memory, right? But here he is actually performing the seduction of his own son, somehow showing his scar, which seems a kind of faintly displaced vaginal cut. And
in place of the substitute, he's mimicking the bride.
yes, and then he's mimicking the bride, so seducing him back, and which, well, would constitute another betrayal of the mother, one would think. But anyway, according to his logic. But then it seems to me there's a question of the father leaning forward, but he does not topple. Georg imagines he might topple, but he doesn't. And then when he sentences him, therefore take note, I sentence you now to death by drowning. It's a strange moment, because this father who has been many sizes, almost toppled, in bed, out of bed, Georg felt himself urged from the room, right? This enormous power of the paternal voice to literally move him from the room. The crash with which his father fell on the bed behind him was still in his ears as he fled. Now, why does the father crash at that moment? It's very interesting as he sentences, because that might be something like the blood circle you were saying, or the kind of primary dad business as opposed to the Oedipal one. Like that the linkage is so fundamental that the one cannot be sentenced to death without the other toppling. Why is it the father falls there? We hear the crash, but Georg is still urged from the room. This character who's supposed to be paternal law, all powerful, at the moment in which he makes that, when he delivers his death sentence, nevertheless crashes. And although Georg is, in the English, on the one hand, urged from the room, and on the other hand, flees from the room, and it really makes a difference which one he's doing. We should take a look.
What you said does fit the corporeal nature of that early relationship with her father.
Yes.
In the German, he feels how he is chased or hunted out of the room.
Ja, fühlte sich
Ein
aus dem
Schlag,
Zimmer
which is a blow more than a crash.
Yes.
Den Schlag, mit dem der Vater in den aufs Bett stürzte, trug, I mean, it's a very corporeal image of carrying, trug noch in den Ohren davon.
Yeah.
So as much as the verdict itself, it's this sonic blow.
Sonic blow. Sonic blow of dad falling. Yes.
The bond that pushes him. And she carries.
Yes.
For perhaps the Benjaminian purposes or other purposes here or elsewhere, you mentioned the business of the watch. That's something that becomes perhaps more recognizable in other works by Kafka, but here you have it from the start, this playing with, really in an allegorical way, with the detritus of belief systems. Father Time, and the maid who's always in the position in Kafka's works of misrecognizing the figure passing by, passing on. But still she's allowed to shout out, Jesus!
Yes.
Georg rushes off.
See, I focused on that figure in something I wrote once, which is the cleaning lady, or
Yes.
I don't know what it is in English.
Charwoman.
The char, whatever that is. So she's the witness. She's at the bottom of the stairs. She also has, as I recall, a feather in her hat. So it's as if she's going to be the writer, you know, because it's the plume. She somehow gets to say and also not say, maybe desecrate the theological drive of the text. Because here it gets named, it may be now his name, who is abandoned by his father and crucified upside down in a way. And so there's suddenly a re-inscription of the sacrificed son.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of the thinking of how sons are sacrificed, in a sense. Unlike the sons in Expressionism that everyone wrote about at this time, Kafka never was truly patricidal. It's always the kid, the son, that internalizes the blow, the schlag, and does himself in. But the figure of the cleaning lady, the one who cleans up,
Yeah.
the one who's left with the litter and the literature and the remains, the one who can look through, you know, the waste baskets, who deals with the waste. And there's a lot of wasting in Kafka, in the Metamorphosis. There's a wasting of bodies that cleaning ladies have to manipulate or read or put together or make sure that there's a bin of forgetfulness. They have to put it away. So Kafka also says something about the stature and status, the falling stature of literature, which is no longer has the transcendental guarantee or the moment of redemption, because the cleaning lady, even though she may or may not be abjected, I'm not judging. Let's say that the last word, but it's not the last word, but the last kind of witness affirmation comes from the figure, or what's left of figuration, of the cleanup crew of one, the cleaning lady. And what that at all means. Does she have to clean up all the shit that now hit the fan here?
Well,
Does she,
DSK, no.
yeah, exactly. Now I wanted to say, we ourselves are nowadays confronted with the whole collective cultural abjection and new readability, unreadability of this barely, let's say, enrolled figure who has to deal with the mess of these boys. I mean, this is the feminine, this is maybe the return of the dead mother who's going to clean up their tushes and their acts for them. This is maybe Virgin Mary territory, who will name the son and hold him in and as Jesus, and so on and so forth.
It's interesting that it is that he does get, as it were, renamed Jesus at the end, and that she then covers herself. She doesn't want to see it, but he's already gone, right? And that suggests the sacrifice, but it also, we're not sure about whether this is the suicidal effort to please the parents, which is what makes it so kind of painful and vacillating at the end. Is he being pushed? Is he clutching to the railings as if it's starving food? And one could stay at that level. Like, is the father's judgment so strong that it literally pushes him from the room, and his will is no will? He's propelled by the will of the other, or is it the passionate sexual relation to the father and wish to do precisely what he asks him to do, that has him both pushed over the rail, but also very, very deliberately doing his gymnastics over the rail, very deliberately pleasing him again, right? We might say echoing or citing precisely that gesture that gave the parents pleasure before, declaring love, and then plummeting, dropping, so it's not just for me the question of whether the paternal law, the paternal verdict, is the force that makes it happen, whether the paternal verdict only works in relation to the passionate masochism of the son who seeks to please at the moment of his self-immolation. But a third possibility, which I think comes out in that final sentence, which is actually a tactical disappearance act for the purposes of surviving and writing. Right, because it's precisely at the point, with weakening grip, he was still holding on when he spied between the railings a motor bus coming, which would easily cover the noise of his fall. Now, that may be, they should be saved from the noise of my fall. My poor father, he doesn't need to hear my fall, although he's already heard his. Right, the father's fall has crashed before him. But it might also be a way of a disappearing act, because we don't see what happens next. No, we're not told anything. We get the final love declaration, and at that moment, the unending stream, some strange infinity, some almost infinite something comes along, which is weird. And instead of a kind of absolute final death, we get an ambiguous, unending traffic. And something is writing that. And whatever this narrative voice is has not been introduced and is not a character. It's a writing without character. And so we're actually left with a very strange kind of moment. Is this a successful suicide, or is it actually a suicide that somehow becomes a survival in writing? And so the dissolution of character maybe, but with the survival in writing. I don't know how to think of it. Or even the persistence of pleasure.
Or the Californian totality that Larry suggested we bear in mind, which is the cliches of American refusals to mourn, such as move on,
Oh, I see.
getting over it. What
Oh,
are
so
they?
this is a foreclosure of grief.
Yeah, this is a release. This is libidinal upsurge. Now everything is rock and rolling.
I see.
Things are moving finally.
I
This
see.
kind of stagnant paralysis, and thanks to this sacrificial jump and pump,
We can all get off.
now everything that
was
starts
good.
speeding up,
Yeah.
right?
But it takes the place of it's the ejaculatory moment that takes the place of an unutterable grief. Of some kind.
Yes, maybe to fall into the lexicon that Larry introduced, the manic triumphal moment of denial that, so glad to get rid of this
Yeah.
thing, and just the surge of the life-affirming moment that would replace a kind of grief-stricken.
Yeah.
No one's left to grieve except the cleaning lady.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to say anything against cleaning ladies, but that is the griever. The bereavement is on her
That's true.
hat.
She sees it. She sees it. She can't bear to see it. She
Right.
covers herself. She
So
sees it.
what kind of a witness is this?
Yeah. No witness. No witness.
I mean, the closing verkehr reopens the opening verkehr, the letter writing. This is
Yes.
how we enter the story and the judgment. That verkehr has become legible for the first time through the father's interruption, but he doesn't shut it down.
No, he does not shut it down. There's some unending verkehr that the father fails to shut down. And, but also, I don't know if this is fair or right, but on the one hand, we know he referred to this as an ejaculation, especially in the end, but we also know it's a bloody birth. So in some sense, Kafka re-monopolizes sexual difference at the end, right? He's giving birth, he's ejaculating, he's doing a lot of different things at the same moment.
And summoning a ghost.
And so,
Yes.
yes,
And thinking of Freud, for things.
yes, thinking of Freud, let's not forget. Do you have some questions for Larry? I thought maybe we'd just discuss this a little bit before coming to Avital and another paternal scene. Yeah.
Kafka writes, I judge you, not Ishperipuni. And then he goes, Routledge, we come back. And the father disappears.
Okay, so say
No,
it's
it's just a difficulty in finding the father. I see the text.
yes.
And it's wrong with it. And I find written, I judge you, and the judgment.
The judgment. But are you asking whether the father's judgment is the final judgment, or whether there's another judgment, which is the
Right.
story?
No, I wonder if the judgment is a yes, but I mean, what you were saying, so right, so be written as sense, I mean, so.
That in order for the judgment to produce itself, it has to have eliminated the figure of the father and the son in order to proclaim itself and entitle itself and write itself out. Is how I would translate.
Do you want to address this in some way?
I think it, as Avital said, And as you also said, there's a, should I say, the trappings, you called it, referred to character. Remember, the trappings of metaphorization or Oedipalization are evacuated. And that's already given, I think it's so pronounced in the title, if I understood.
Kafka does this systematically. He mangles the very notion of a figure or a character. I mean, some of his characters are letters running around vast territories of disenfranchisement. And some of his characters are mice shrieking operatic arias in desperate efforts to control its people. So the disfiguration of, this is very, actually a very good moment to bring us to, which is if Kafka systematically disfigures or undermines the fullness of, let's say, the characters that are ascribable to modernity and literature until this point, are we still hanging on to the fullness of the paternal or even the filiation, the son, or isn't that also kicked into some sort of unrecognizable wound or scar? Because you see the scarring. Kafka's going to turn everything into a kind of graffiti of scarring, of abbreviation, reduction. His great characters are something like vermin, and a whole zoography of speaking, communicating creatures that aren't quite recognizable, and so on and so forth. And yet, we claim to recognize the paternal. I'm just pushing this shamelessly toward where I would want it to go, since we're dreaming and thinking of Freud. Freud, who's been thinking the paternal and trying to insist on paternal. Freud says, why are we still contending with the victory of patriarchy and its figurations? Why are they still pumping meaning and power? And why do they still hold authority? So maybe the question, and this is what's important about that scene also, and it's true, the sizing in Kafka, from the speck to the spectacular, that keeps on moving. Is the father a tiny speck or mote, or is he suddenly monstrously sublime like these Alps and out to get you? And in fact, in Kafka, by the way, it's the speck that undoes patriarchy. Like if you see a figure of authority in Kafka, and it suddenly has, it's like going to your professor's office. I'm now assuming you have great respect for that person or representative, and you see a little touch of ketchup.
Mayonnaise. It's got to be mayonnaise.
It's got to be mayonnaise. In my life, it was ketchup. And you think, ew, what? Okay, this is my life in graduate school. Ew, what a slob. This is not my... What happened? The ego ideal just toppled, you know?
Crap.
But and Kafka has the sense that maybe Abraham was a slob. And that's the end of patriarchy. That's all you need to take the whole house down. The thing of, not you, of course, mayonnaise.
I'm always already castrated.
Or ketchup, just a piece of shit or something. But that's it. We're done. We're done here.
We're done here.
In the house of metaphysics and patriarchy.
Yeah.
That's what it takes.
That is what it takes.
You know. So
Can we just meditate for a moment on the word das Urteil? Because Urteil is like an original division, no? Teilen. An original division. So that's what I actually take from that title, that what is this strange originary divisiveness, this linking that can't really be divided, but which is so divisive between father and son here. It's more like a scene than simply the verdict, although it is also the verdict, right? I don't know if that addresses you. Yeah?
Everything happens.
Oh, okay, everything addresses.
You know, Lacan said that no conscious person can be a father. So, and Kafka also, he's asking what constitutes the paternal? What is the father? Lacan says, look, you have to choose between le père ou le pire. You know, either the father or worse than the father, like kind of in a Carl Schmittian Mad Max kind of way, that if you don't have this figure to duke it out with, it's going to be really even worse, because you won't be able to locate the enemy, so to speak.
And maybe something we were talking earlier about the divestment of gestures from their humanness, the hands becoming steam engines. You know, it's through this kind of divestment that we maybe still have see some light emanating, messianic light emanating from the object that allows for revolutionary potential. Maybe in the same way, Kafka definitely does it by making his characters animals, by divesting them of their humanness, but even in this last scene, the possibility of divesting a character of life itself is what allows the father to be undone, or allows for some sort of revolutionary shift here.
Because I mean, there is that question of whether the character literally orchestrates the disappearance so that he can no longer be the target, and saving himself. Maybe not saving himself. It's not quite self-preservation, but persisting.
Persisting
A
through
persistence
writing.
at the level of writing.
Yeah.
Which is a different question. Kind of because some writing persists.
Yeah.
And what is the moment of Verkehr? It's correspondence, sexuality, traffic. It's the there's no characterological self. There's no literary character at that moment. There's something else. Yeah, sorry.
I was wondering if you would mind commenting more on the character of the friend, the specter of the friend, really. In particular, I'm wondering if, many strange circumstances surround the relationship with the friend. He's indifferent about the death of a mother, he lives in Russia for some reason, as Georg is sort of edibly doing well in his life, outstripping his father's role. The friend seems to, at least in Georg's mind, the friend seems to have a kind of critical stance, a condescending stance towards him, even if he's not coming to the wedding, these things. I'm wondering if the friend occupies perhaps a role or a place in Georg's ego in some way. I mean, it seems like it's an odd characterization. So I wonder if you comment a little more about the friend.
Yes, you remember everything I said about the shallowness of Georg's way of seeing, but that's the exception, of course. There's a lot of detail put into the friend, you could say projected into him. But it's there that the whole issue of mourning the mother can possibly be stated. I'm sure that's what the letter writing Verkehr is also about. Remember, it coincides with the period of the mother's loss. And so the issue of mourning, or rather of unmourning, comes up in the course of this correspondence. I think Kafka, or the internal fathers, mean for it to be possible at least to read him as a projection and a ghost sustained by this Verkehr, who then becomes reduced, first in Georg's characterization or description, and then is it the father who says that? But he's turning yellow like parchment. Mm-hmm. He's sort of turning into a writing surface to get ready for the final Verkehr.
Yeah.
So he's kind of, but we watch him being used up as a blotting surface for characterization too close to home, for so much that Georg needs to be stabilized. I mean, for all his shallowness, he's also the normal subject. What he does with his father's business is normal. He accepts the death of the parent as the constitutive moment already of adolescence, and works through it. It's considered normal to benefit from one's losses. At the same time, the aberration of the friend is what links, I think, to the closing Verkehr and alerts us to the process of working through decharacterization, what have you, that ends up leaving him a yellow piece of parchment. I think he's even referred to as something that could be discarded. But anyway, I don't know if that answers.
It just expresses a certain intuitive feeling that I have right now. Something in me also wants to draw on this character or phenomenon of the friend, to see this in some strange homoerotic kind of porno way. I mean, I'm thinking very spontaneously, but for me also Urteil is almost like the original piece.
Original piece,
like, like a slang, like, you know, geilen Teil.
I want to smoke it.
You know, and then this ambiguity also in the German with like, aber du kannst doch mein Freund, like mein Freund, which in German, you know, there's always this, okay, if you make it immediately possessive, is he your boyfriend?
Or you would translate my boyfriend, that would be great.
A Freund von mir,
Well, yeah,
like just
and
my
he's having
friend.
trouble confessing that engagement.
And I'm wondering if there's somehow within this also father dynamic just an issue of like the homoerotic like panic of intimacy that can take place here. But I mean the father is also very, he gets really nasty here. I don't have the English on hand, but here in the German he's talking about. Yeah, at the end he's saying like, yeah, and something like, and you wanted to go sit with your behind on him, and then he wouldn't, rührt sich nicht. But then, and then he somehow idealizes this friend as more of a son to him, or like, as having more value to him than his own son, and then he somehow degrades the intimacy that the son feels between this friend of his by saying, hey, you know, you just wanted to go and sit on his lap, you know? And then the end for me, this whole Verkehr thing,
Father's
kind of
springing erect time and again.
exactly. And then at the end for me, this is maybe a bit cracked out, but
Oh yeah, the rest of it wasn't.
this is perhaps the most cracked out because kind of a play on the grammar of the syntax of the German in the last sentence. In diesem Augenblick ging über die Brücke eine geradezu unendlicher Verkehr. If that is an ejaculation, if the ejaculation is going over the bridge into this eye blick, like, is it some kind of cum shot that burns?
It is true that Kafka went to the movies, and we now have a book on Kafka in the movies, but I don't think he really...
Okay, that's a good correction.
Yeah, they weren't really doing that in 1912.
But
Kafka's known for his futuristic.
It's true. But no, I think this is an important point, and I think it's there throughout. Whoever this friend is, he's in real trouble. Well, first of all, he's in trouble telling about the engagement, but also he notes that the friend wrote back after Georg wrote to say that his mother had died, and the friend expresses his sympathy in a letter phrased so dryly that the grief caused by such an event, one had to conclude, could not be realized in a distant country. So there's some way in which the friend is also kind of standing for the unrealizability of grief. right? And that dry phrasing is precisely what comes back at the end, where you're suggesting that there might also be a kind of cut away from the unspeakable grief, right? So that, you know, one could say that the friend is nothing other than the place of dry grief. At the same time, it's true that there's a triangulation. Who's got the friend? Who's connected to the friend? And what's more offensive to the father? Georg's engagement to Fräulein Friede Brandenfeld, or whatever she's called, or the closeted correspondence, right? And it seems to me that both are equally impossible, at which point we do get a slightly hysterical bisexuality on the part of the father, right? Where he's lifting up his skirt, seducing his son, as he imagines the son seducing Fräulein Friede, and then also clutching, you know, claiming to be the true representative of the friend, and having a special Verbindung over there, a special connection over there that the son doesn't have. So anything the son might appear to want the father in a kind of omnivorous bisexuality owns for himself, which goes back to the question of not only monopolizing sexual difference, as you suggested, but monopolizing every possible object choice that the son could have erotically. And shamelessly, you know, that's not the problem. The problem is not appearing unmanned or manning up or whatever it is. The problem is monopoly.
And also, one thing that we haven't yet addressed is the different layers in which not only the possibilities of intimacy or kind of failed intimacy or misunderstood intimacy in the story function, but also how the story itself, here it says, you know, that it's for Kafka's long-distance lover at that point, for Felice. So how does this form of intimacy, and also the failure of that relationship that they had, that he went to Berlin and tried to live in Berlin and tried to get away from his father, and they ended their relationship and came back. In what role can that also be somehow read in the roles of play?
It's there. It's there.
Yeah.
She wasn't altogether happy with the story. You probably have something to say.
Did she write that?
I think she ignored it.
We're cooked. We're done.
So let's take Maya's question and we'll take a brief break.
I'm not going to be able to bring this together really, but I wonder, you know, if there's this triangulation on the one hand, if there's another triangulation perhaps between the charwoman, the mother, and the fiancé, where, you know, you were talking, I know that in German it's Bedienerin, and so it's a bit different than charwoman, but I didn't know this word when I was looking at charwoman, and if she is the one who washes away the marks, and the father is dirty, she hasn't gotten there yet, she's just on her way up, right, she hasn't been able to wash it yet. I wonder, and then you were talking about the father as a kind of parchment or as a kind of blotter. I wonder if there might be some sort of connection between these different triangulations in terms of a palimpsest, because there's this moment at the end, I don't know what happens to him at the end, but there is a bridge, so one might presume there might be water, and he lets himself hinfallen. So maybe if he doesn't fall, maybe there might even be some sort of mirror there. I don't know, but it's just, there's just.
That's very helpful to think in terms of triangulation, first of all, because that is recurrent, and there are these secret societies in all of these texts, and I think only begun to open them with very special passwords, and I'm very happy for what you say of the kind of secret society of the. You're right. I mean, to what extent is the Bedienerin substituting hunting for the mother And one of the texts that I would have wanted to talk about when I suddenly, in my own Fekera surge right before we met, I thought, yes, and then in a manic moment we should also go to the test, die Prüfung, which is about being a diener or a servant, what it means to serve the other, the household, the house of God, what service is, military service, what it means to do service in Kafka. And that would be also the service of carrying out a judgment. What does it serve? This is a Freudian question. Whom does it serve? Who are the beneficiaries? What does this serve? Who's serving whom? And what does the friend in Russia serve as, and so on and so forth. But I think you're quite right to line up the momentary captures of the feminine and the more masculinist setups, and see how Kafka creates relatedness, interlocution, failure, cleanup. There's a lot of cleanup in Kafka. And I know I'm repeating, but it's very important, especially for us nowadays. We're left to clean up so much shit, politically and otherwise, ethically. And Kafka started installing these impossible cleaning machines and figures and technologies. I think Larry pointing us to the aerotrace and the air flight is very important as well for other reasons. There was also that famous postcard, right, with Kafka in an amusement park, had himself photographed. Have you seen that? Where he's in an airplane. I want to make a closure gesture and remark, because Freud says that's what comforts everyone, and that's what we need, but it's your fault though. Opened another dossier, but you can clean it up.
No, we're going to let this debris hang. Anyway, why don't we take a brief break and come back.